Today's ancient witness comes from the book of Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice, for a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone.
Good morning, everybody. So a lot of you know me. I know a lot of you. My name is Leda Zakarison, and I grew up in this church. I was baptized in this church. I was confirmed in this church. So I'm super happy to be back. My lovely worship assistant, Christine Zakarison, is also here, so you'll be hearing from her later. But after I left the Pullman and went to university, I then moved to Seattle. So I want to give you a little background of what I've been doing before we start talking about what we're going to talk about today. So in 2017, I was part of the Justice Leadership Program in Seattle, which is a program through the UCC where you serve at a UCC church and at a local nonprofit. So I was serving for a nonprofit called Earth Ministry, which works with faith communities who want to focus on creation care and environmental stewardship. So you may have heard me at this church talking about various bills to support creation care in Washington State. And then after I finished that, I had the opportunity to move to Beirut, Lebanon for 3 years. I was serving as a global mission intern with Global Ministries. Global Ministries is the joint global ministry, if you will, of the United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. So while I was in Beirut, I was serving at an organization called the Forum for Development, Culture, and Dialogue. FDCD promotes peace building, equal citizenship, and human rights in Lebanon and Syria and the whole region by creating common spaces for dialogue and building the capacity of community and civil society groups so they can be catalysts for peace. FDCD does this through workshops, dialogue sessions, and trainings about peace building and active citizenship, as well as through direct humanitarian aid, some of which is supported by Global Ministries. And because you all support this church, you're supporting that work as well. In all of its projects, FDCD focuses on skill building and trainings to give local organizations and individuals the tools they need to be change makers in their communities. So that's what I've been doing. I moved back 2 months ago. But as I mentioned, before I left for Beirut, I was working for Earth Ministry, and so I was already spending a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a person of faith who's also actively working to create a more just world where people are all treated with dignity, especially when it feels like we're up against enormous odds, such as the impending destruction of the world due to climate change. But one of the great things that I found about being a person of faith doing this work is that we have thousands of years of history and examples of people who are trying to understand and enact God's will and to do this work of justice while also dealing with all the realities of the world and of being human. So we'll see that today in our reading from the Gospel of Mark. So this story of Jesus comes in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. We're right in the middle of Jesus' ministry. Many of the stories that we know from Mark, like the parable of the sower, the calling of the 12 disciples, and so on have already happened. And Jesus has been traveling all over the region of Galilee, from Bethlehem to Nazareth, crisscrossing back and forth across the Sea of Galilee, and visiting all sorts of small villages, preaching his message. He's also started getting some attention, both positive and negative. The Pharisees have started to notice what he's saying, and the Pharaoh has too, and they're not super happy about it. John the Baptist, his cousin, has already been killed by the state. So all in all, it sounds like kind of an exhausting time. So we're told in this passage at the beginning that Jesus went away to the region of Tyre, or Tyre and Sidon. Now, I don't have my map with me, but Tyre is about 50 kilometers north of the Sea of Galilee. And I love it. I've been there many times because it's in modern day Lebanon, and it's known for its beautiful sandy beaches and sunsets. It's also notably not an area where Jews lived at this time. Tyre is out of the way in a Gentile area, and Jesus goes away secretly. To me, it sounds like he's exhausted and burnt out and needs a vacation and is just trying to do some self-care at the beach, which I understand. I have done the same thing in Tyre. But while he's there, even though he tried to be so secret, he's approached by a woman who asks for healing for his daughter. Now, as some of you know from my mom, there are a lot of unnamed women in the Bible, and I don't really like that. So we're going to give this woman a name. I'm naming her Amal, which means hope in Arabic. So Jesus is exhausted, and he's approached by Amal, an exhausted mother trying to do anything to get her daughter healed while just living the life of a peasant in the Mediterranean. So let's pause here. What would you do in this situation? You've been hard at work. Maybe it's finally spring break and you get a vacation. So much has been asked of you, and now a stranger who's outside of your sphere of care is asking you for help. What would you do? So now we're going to fast forward about 2,000 years and just about 50 miles north of Tyre to Beirut. When I arrived in Beirut, it was March 2020, and things were kind of unstable, but we weren't totally sure how unstable yet. In the year leading up to when I moved to Beirut, things had already started to get a little bit concerning. In October 2019, protests around the country brought some hope as people demanded accountability and transparency from their government and demanded an increased quality of life. But as these protests continued, the unity and hope started to dissipate and fizzle, and people started to break out into violent clashes and sectarian division. At the same time, the economic collapse of Lebanon had started, and economic concerns became many people's primary concern. By March 2020, the value of the lira had started to plummet already, and we'll talk about this more, but the official value of the Lebanese lira for many years was about 1,500 Lebanese lira to the dollar. By March, it was already about 3,000 lira to the dollar. So imagine if every dollar you had was now 50 cents. And that's just the beginning. So in March, we were concerned about inflation, and the first cases of COVID started to be reported. With the rest of the world, Lebanon went into lockdown. But unlike the US and other countries, the Lebanon has basically no social safety net. As the value of the lira depreciated, so too did the purchasing power of money and bank accounts. And people watched as they couldn't go to work and as they lost their jobs and as their savings and pensions disappeared. And then, just as the world started to reopen in the summer of 2020, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which had been improperly stored at the port of Beirut, exploded. More than 200 people were killed, more than 5,000 were injured, and an estimated 300,000 people were rendered homeless in an instant. In an already desperate time, it seemed impossible that the city could ever recover from this sort of tragedy. But before the dust had even settled, people from all over Lebanon started contributing to relief efforts however they could. They started driving people to the hospital on motorbikes, treating wounds, cleaning up homes, rescuing cats and dogs, bringing water and bread to people in need. Social media was flooded with opportunities to help, and the message was clear. Grab a broom or a mask and some gloves and start cleaning. We need all the help we can get. I would like to say that I was there on that first date, but in fact, the day after the explosion, I felt frozen. I felt immobilized. I literally hid under my covers in my bed, and I watched photos and the news stream in on Twitter and Instagram about the level of destruction. I didn't just feel like I was kind of at the limit of what I could handle. I felt that I was so far beyond. I didn't know how I was ever going to get out of bed and figure out what was next. But the world goes on, and we started texting at FDCD, and we decided that we needed to meet and start to make a plan. So on August 6th, the whole staff of FDCD met at our office. Driving to the office, I saw for the first time the extent of the damage, and I wondered how we were ever going to even start rebuilding. And then we got to the office, we had coffee, we checked in, we hugged, we mourned, we shared our fears and our experiences. We had some more coffee, and then we started to make a plan. What resources did we have? Who could we ask for support? How and where could we be the most effective amongst all of the rebuilding efforts? The coordinators for the FDCD youth programs told us that dozens of young participants from across Lebanon had already reached out to them, saying that they wanted to help and wanting to know what we would be doing. So that weekend, youth and young adults from all across Lebanon traveled to Beirut to help in cleanup efforts. I joined them too, sweeping up debris, picking up toppled furniture, and removing damaged items from homes. In the following months, supporters of FDCD, including Global Ministries, came together to raise funds so that we could rebuild homes and small businesses, provide food parcels for families in need, and offer psychosocial support to those who were impacted by the explosion. In this phase, too, FDCD did not work alone. We worked with churches and local organizations from the neighborhoods that were the most impacted to provide help in any way we could. So let's go back to Jesus and Amal. Amal asks Jesus to help her daughter, and Jesus reacts not very kindly. He says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." It's not his job or concern to take care of this woman, a foreigner, a Gentile, especially when he's trying to rest. She's outside the scope of his ministry. But when Jesus says this, the woman doesn't back down. She pushes back, and she reminds him that even in exhaustion, there's abundance. God's love is always enough to go around, and there is always some left for every person at the table. It doesn't have to be an either-or situation. And in that moment, we watch Jesus change his mind. And a miracle does occur, and the woman's daughter is healed. But here's the thing. This miracle would not have happened if either of them had been acting by themselves. If Jesus had come to Tyre and this woman hadn't approached him, maybe even if he had encountered a sick Syrophoenician girl on the road, he would not have stopped to heal her. And no matter how desperate Amal was to heal her daughter, she needed Jesus to help enact this miracle. And so these two completely different people of different genders, ethnicities, speaking different languages and different religions, happened to be in the same place at the same time. Maybe the right place at the right time, to share God's love with one another and make something miraculous happen. They came together in all of their fear and fatigue and brokenness and humanness, and together they healed one of God's children. I wish that the story of the cleanup effort in Beirut had an easy, happy ending like the story of Amal and her daughter. The reality is that even in those early days, relief efforts were disorganized and confusing, and egos and competing strategies were getting in the way. And it was also really, really hot, like 100 degrees with no air conditioning, and we were all in long pants, and that makes you really cranky. At the end of the day, everyone involved in the relief effort was human, and they were trying to figure out how to move on, how to rebuild after experiencing unthinkable tragedy on top of unthinkable tragedy. And then the lira rate continued to plummet. The fuel crisis started so that people had to wait in line for the whole day to get a few liters of gasoline. There was no access to medicines or essentials like diapers and baby formula, and parents were being warned not to water down their baby formula because it could kill their babies. As the summer ended and the winter rain started, people were still living in damaged homes, and the water was running through. Sectarian tension that's been present in Lebanon since the Civil War started to spill over into armed conflicts. And even to this day, nobody has been held accountable for the destruction caused by the ammonium nitrate that was knowingly improperly stored at the port. In August 2020, the rate of the Lebanese lira was around 15,000 to 20,000 lira per dollar. So now imagine that each dollar that you have is worth 10 cents. That already felt impossible. Today, the rate of the Lebanese lira is around 80,000 lira to the dollar, and we're expecting very soon that it will reach 100,000 lira to the dollar. Although elections did occur last year, members of parliament have not been able to reach enough of a consensus to put a new government in place. Schools have stopped running because they don't have money to pay the teachers or run the generators. You can't get a driver's license right now or a passport because there's nobody at the offices, and there's no paper to put in the printers to print out the documents that are needed. Electricity outages still plague the country, and people are waiting for a promise of maybe 4 hours of government-provided electricity a day. There have been so many times in the past 2 years since the explosion when I have thought there was no way to keep going, no way to work for a better future in Lebanon where all people can live with dignity. There have been so many setbacks and so many tragedies. But what I learned during my time in Beirut is that these tragedies are so much easier to face when you have a community with you. Just like Jesus and Amal, we can't heal, we can't spread the love of God alone. We need a community of people who will challenge us and teach us and support us and believe in us to make change. I want to leave you with one last story. A few weeks ago, I was sitting at my home watching Dr. Quinn with my mom. That's what we've been doing a lot of. I had a purring cat on my lap. Things felt pretty good. And I received the dreaded message from the FDCD group WhatsApp chat, which I'm still a part of. Is everyone okay? My world stopped. My heart dropped, my stomach tied in a knot, my head span. It's a message that you never want to receive, and I've received and sent it way too many times in the past 3 years. So as the news started to pour in, I learned what had happened to cause this message. A 7.8 magnitude earthquake had struck in southern Turkey. The earthquake was so big and so devastating that it shook windows and knocked down furniture in Beirut, where it was felt as about a 4.5 magnitude earthquake. In Tripoli, in northern Lebanon, buildings were damaged. And in Aleppo, where FDCD works and has many friends and partners, the destruction was massive. And I had that same thought that I have had so many times. How will people possibly ever begin to recover from this? This earthquake and the earthquakes that have followed have been devastating. Material rebuilding will last for years, and the psychological damage will remain for lifetimes. But already, global ministries, FDCDs, and our partners are assessing the situation in northern Syria and creating plans for providing relief. Teams of rescue workers from Lebanon, from Palestine even, some of whom were also on the scene in the hours and the days after the explosion, traveled to help with relief efforts in southern Turkey. The region and the world is coming together once again to support relief efforts. To be honest, I don't know what will happen in Syria or in Lebanon. On most days, I don't really feel that optimistic, and I think there will be a lot more hardship before things start to get better. But one thing that I've learned from being in Beirut, and what we're reminded in our story today of Jesus and Amal, the Syrophoenician woman from Tyre, is that we're not doing any of this work on our own. In the face of exhaustion and tragedy and fear, the only way we can possibly hope to heal is by supporting one another and working together to create the world that we envision. Amen. Please join me in hymn number 539, Won't You Let Me Be Your Servant? And we'll sing verses 1 through 4 and then verse number 1 again.